Eleanor Whitfield stood in the marble foyer of her son's mansion, holding a silver tray with trembling hands, and listened as the woman he was about to marry called her worthless in front of the household staff. 3 weeks earlier, she had walked into this house as a stranger to everyone but her son, wearing a grey uniform instead of the pearls she used to wear to his company galas. Marcus had built an empire from nothing, and Eleanor had raised him from nothing, and now she was terrified that everything they had built together was about to be handed to a woman who saw people like her as furniture. Vanessa Cole did not know that the quiet, grey-haired maid she mocked every morning was the mother of the man she called her soulmate. Eleanor had asked for exactly one thing before the wedding, a chance to see who Vanessa really was when she thought no one important was watching, and what she was learning now made her stomach turn. She had raised her son to believe that kindness was not optional, and that character mattered more than a bank account, and she was not going to watch him build a life with someone who had neither. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 26 years ago, Eleanor Whitfield was a young widow in a small apartment outside Nashville, raising her son Marcus alone after his father passed away in a construction accident that left them with nothing but debt and a stack of unpaid bills. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices before dawn and waiting tables until midnight, and she never once let Marcus see her cry, even on the nights when she counted coins on the kitchen table to see if there was enough for both rent and groceries. She told him every single day that where they started did not decide where they would end up, and she made him promise that no matter how much money he made one day, he would never forget the people who had nothing. Marcus carried that promise with him through community college, through the failed first business that nearly broke him, and through the software company he eventually built that made him one of the wealthiest men in Tennessee before he turned 40. Eleanor remembered those early years in fragments that still ambushed her at unexpected moments. The smell of industrial cleaner on her hands at midnight, the particular ache of standing on a bus after a double shift, with her feet swollen inside shoes 2 sizes too small because she could not justify buying new ones. She remembered Marcus as a small boy sitting quietly in the corner of whatever office she cleaned that week, doing his homework by the light of someone else's desk lamp, never once complaining that other children got to go home right after school while he waited for his mother to finish scrubbing floors that were not hers. She had promised herself in those years that she would build him a life where he never again had to wait in the corner of someone else's success, and slowly, through relentless work and a stubbornness that surprised even her, she had kept that promise. Marcus never moved his mother into the mansion he offered her once his company began to succeed. Eleanor insisted she needed very little, staying instead in the same modest house on the edge of town where she had raised him, with the same small kitchen table where they had once counted coins together. Marcus visited her every single Sunday without fail, a tradition that had not changed even after Forbes put his name on a list of the wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs in the state, and even after his calendar filled with board meetings and investor calls that would have given most men an excuse to let a weekly family visit slip away. He brought groceries every time, though she rarely needed them, because bringing something to his mother's table was the only way he knew how to say thank you for a debt he understood he could never fully repay. The trouble started the way it always does, quietly, with a woman who seemed perfect on paper. Vanessa Cole was polished, magnetic, and endlessly charming in every room she walked into, and she had captured Marcus's attention at a charity gala where she spoke passionately about philanthropy and helping underserved communities. She complimented his work ethic, remembered small details about his childhood he mentioned only once, and made him feel like the most important man in any room they entered together. Within 4 months they were engaged, and Marcus called his mother the same night, his voice full of a happiness she had not heard from him in years, a happiness that made her want to believe every doubt she carried was simply an overprotective mother's imagination working against her. Eleanor wanted to be happy for him. She tried, in the weeks that followed, to be happy for him, attending the engagement dinner with a smile she practiced in the mirror beforehand, telling herself that her son was a grown man, capable of choosing his own partner without his mother's approval hovering over every decision. But something about the way Vanessa's eyes moved across a room, cataloging value instead of people, sat wrong in her stomach, in a way she could not explain to her son without sounding jealous or bitter. standing in the way of the joy he so clearly wanted to feel. She noticed the way Vanessa's attention shifted the moment someone influential entered a conversation, how her laughter grew slightly louder around Marcus's business partners, how she seemed to perform warmth rather than simply feel it. She met Vanessa exactly twice before the engagement, both times at events with people watching, both times perfectly pleasant exchanges that left Eleanor with more questions than answers. She noticed how Vanessa's attention would drift toward Marcus's business partners during conversations, how she asked pointed questions about the company's recent valuation at a dinner meant to celebrate the engagement, and how her warmth seemed to switch on and off, depending on who was in the room and what they could offer her. Eleanor had spent her whole life reading people because she had to, because there had been no safety net beneath her and Marcus when he was small, and that same instinct was now telling her that something about this woman did not add up. She could not prove it. She could not even properly name it. So she decided that the only way to know for certain was to see Vanessa in a room where she believed no one worth impressing was watching at all. What Eleanor did not know yet, in those early weeks of quiet suspicion, was that Vanessa was not acting alone. Inside Marcus's own company, a senior executive named Gregory Vance had been quietly nursing a resentment that had been building for over a year, ever since Marcus passed him over for a promotion to Chief Operating Officer, in favor of a younger analyst with fresher ideas and a track record Gregory could not match. Gregory had spent 15 years climbing toward that title, and watching it go to someone else had left him convinced that Marcus no longer valued loyalty or tenure, only youth and innovation. And that conviction had curdled slowly into something closer to a plan than a grudge. He had met Vanessa at the same charity gala where she first charmed Marcus, and within a single conversation, the two of them had recognized in each other a shared hunger that most people around them could not see beneath their polish. Gregory understood the company's internal finances in a way few outsiders ever could, and he began feeding Vanessa small pieces of information, disguised as casual conversation, details about upcoming investment rounds, about which assets held the most value, about how the corporate trust was structured in the event of a marriage. Vanessa listened carefully every time, filing away each detail with the same patient calculation she brought to everything else in her life. And in exchange, she promised Gregory that once she was Marcus's wife, she would ensure he was finally given the operational control he believed he deserved. Neither of them spoke the arrangement aloud in specific terms because both were careful enough to understand that some agreements were safer left unspoken, communicated instead through knowing glances at company functions and messages that said less than they meant. Simone Carter, Marcus's executive assistant, noticed Gregory's sudden interest in Vanessa before anyone else did, catching the two of them in low conversation near the elevator banks more often than seemed necessary for two people who had no obvious reason to speak. She mentioned it once to a colleague in passing, only to be told she was reading too much into ordinary office friendliness, and she let the observation go, telling herself that it was not her place to raise suspicions about her boss's fiancé without something more concrete to point to. She did not yet know how important that small, dismissed observation would become, or how much it would eventually matter that she had been the first person in the building to notice something was wrong. Eleanor drove to Marcus's office on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of visit she rarely made because she knew how busy he was, and she waited in the lobby until Simone Carter walked her back to his corner office, overlooking the Cumberland River. Marcus stood up immediately when he saw her face, already reading the seriousness in it, because 26 years of raising a boy alone teaches a mother nothing if not how to recognize the exact moment her child needs to actually listen. She told him plainly that she was not there to accuse Vanessa of anything, because she had no proof and did not believe in destroying a person's reputation on a feeling alone. But she asked him for one thing before the wedding moved forward, a single request that she promised would either put her fears to rest completely or reveal something he needed to see with his own eyes, rather than hear secondhand from his mother. She wanted to move into the mansion as household staff, not as his mother visiting, not as a guest observing from a distance, but as anonymous staff that Vanessa would have no reason to perform kindness for, because in Eleanor's experience, the truest version of a person shows up in how they treat someone they believe cannot help or hurt them in return. Marcus resisted at first, telling her it
She
felt
was with
beneath her,
Betrayal.
that she had scrubbed enough floors in her lifetime and did not need to do it again just to satisfy his mother's suspicion. He reminded her that she was a wealthy woman now by any reasonable measure, that she never had to lift another finger for the rest of her life if she chose not to, and that the idea of her cleaning up after the woman he intended to marry felt like a step backward neither of them should have to take. Eleanor reminded him gently that she was not asking his permission to protect herself. She was asking for the chance to protect him, the way she always had. And if Vanessa truly loved him for who he was, this test would cost her nothing at all. She told him that money had never been the thing she feared losing on his behalf. It was his heart, the same heart she had spent 26 years teaching to stay soft, in a world that often rewarded people for growing hard. Marcus sat with her words for a long moment, staring out at the river below, and finally admitted that some small, quiet part of him had been carrying the same unnamed doubt about Vanessa for weeks, a doubt he had been too afraid to examine too closely because he did not want it to be true. Marcus agreed on one condition, that Simone would be the only other person at the company who knew the truth, so there would be someone who could reach Eleanor quickly if anything ever felt unsafe inside that house. Within a week, Eleanor Whitfield became simply Nora, a soft-spoken woman with graying hair and careful hands, hired through an agency Marcus's household manager used without asking too many questions. She packed one small suitcase, left her pearls in a drawer at home, and walked into her son's mansion through the staff entrance for the first time, feeling her heart pound, the way it had decades earlier, walking into her very first cleaning job, with Marcus, asleep in a stroller, beside the supply closet. Vanessa barely looked at Nora the first morning, waving a hand toward the staircase and telling her the West Wing needed dusting before her stylist arrived at 11, and Eleanor swallowed the sting of being unseen in her own son's home and got to work. The small insults arrived quickly and without any hesitation, the way people speak when they have decided in advance that someone does not deserve their patience. Vanessa called her slow when she was thorough, called her invisible when she stood quietly in a corner waiting for instructions, and once looked directly through her while explaining to a friend on the phone that good help was impossible to find these days, and most of them could not be trusted with anything valuable. Eleanor said nothing back. She had not come into this house to win an argument. She had come to watch, and to remember, and to give her son the truth instead of her opinion. The cruelty was never loud enough to be dramatic, which was in some ways worse, because Eleanor recognized the pattern immediately from her own younger years working for families who treated her as furniture that occasionally needed thanking. Vanessa left cold coffee cups for her to clean without a word of acknowledgement, corrected her in front of guests over things that did not matter, and once made her repeat an entire flower arrangement 3 times over a shade of white that Eleanor suspected did not actually bother her at all, only existed to remind everyone in the room who held the power. Eleanor folded towels with hands that had folded 1,000 towels in 1,000 other houses, and she thought about her son upstairs in his office, believing he had finally found someone soft enough to build a family with, and she felt the old, familiar ache of loving someone so much that watching them walk toward pain becomes a physical thing. There were smaller moments too, the kind that would not have meant much to an outside observer, but that added up steadily in Eleanor's private accounting of who this woman truly was. Vanessa never once asked Nora her last name in 3 weeks of living in the same house. She never asked whether she had children of her own waiting for her somewhere, whether her feet ached at the end of a 12-hour day, whether she had eaten anything since breakfast. She treated every member of the household staff as a category rather than as people, addressing them collectively as "you people" when giving instructions, and Eleanor watched the way the younger staff members flinched slightly at that phrase every time, having grown used to swallowing it the way she once had to. Eleanor began keeping a small mental ledger of every incident, not out of bitterness, but out of the same patient documentation instinct that had once helped her survive difficult employers decades earlier. She noted the day Vanessa refused to let the housekeeper take a break during a 12-hour event setup, the afternoon she blamed a missing earring on a staff member who had not even worked that shift, the evening she mocked another employee's accent in front of dinner guests as though the woman could not hear her from across the room. None of these moments alone would have been enough to end an engagement. Together, they painted the portrait of a woman who believed kindness was a currency to be spent only on people who could offer something valuable in return. Simone Carter arrived at the mansion late one evening, carrying a folder Marcus had forgotten at the office, and she nearly walked past Nora in the hallway before something made her stop and offer a genuine smile instead of the polite nothing most guests gave the staff. She asked Nora if she had eaten dinner yet, and when the answer was a quiet no, Simone insisted on fixing her a plate from the kitchen herself, waving off Nora's protest that it was not her place. Eleanor sat at the small staff table, watching this young woman move with an ease and warmth that cost her nothing and asked for nothing in return, and she thought of how rare that kindness had become in the circles her son now moved through. Simone spoke to her about her own mother back in Memphis, about long shifts and short paychecks, and the dream of one day opening a small bakery, and Eleanor listened with the particular attention of a woman who recognized her younger self sitting across the table. Simone mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother back in Memphis had recently been diagnosed with a health condition that required regular treatment, and that she had been quietly sending home most of her paycheck every month to help cover the costs, leaving very little for herself in the process. She said it without any request for sympathy, simply as a fact of her life, the way a person mentions the weather, and Eleanor noted the absence of self-pity in her voice, with a growing sense of admiration. Simone explained that she had turned down 2 higher-paying job offers from competing firms in the past year alone, not because she doubted her own worth, but because she believed in the work Marcus's company was doing and did not want to abandon a team she had helped build from its early, uncertain days. She did not reveal who she truly was that night, but she remembered every word, and she began to wonder if her son's future was standing in the wrong room entirely. Over the following weeks, Eleanor watched Simone return to the house on small errands for Marcus, always polite, always warm toward every member of the staff regardless of what she might gain from any of them. She watched Simone once help an elderly gardener carry heavy bags of mulch up the driveway without being asked, watched her remember the birthday of a housekeeper's child and bring a small gift without any announcement or expectation of praise, watched the quiet, consistent decency that seemed to define her in every unobserved moment. Vanessa treated Simone with a thinly veiled irritation, calling her Marcus's little errand girl within earshot of guests, unaware that the woman she dismissed carried more integrity in a single afternoon than Vanessa had shown in 3 weeks of engagement. Eleanor noticed the way Marcus's eyes softened slightly whenever Simone entered a room, a flicker he likely did not recognize in himself yet, buried beneath months of convincing himself that Vanessa was the partner he was supposed to want. She said nothing of it to her son. Some truths needed to arrive on their own timing, and Eleanor understood that pushing a person toward a realization before they were ready often pushed them away from it instead. She simply kept watching, kept remembering, and kept waiting for the moment the full picture would reveal itself. Inside the company, Gregory Vance grew increasingly impatient as the wedding date approached, aware that his entire plan depended on Vanessa successfully becoming Marcus's wife before anyone uncovered the arrangement between them. He began pressing her for updates during their brief, careful meetings, reminding her that the operational control she had promised him could not happen until the marriage was finalized and the corporate trust documents were updated to reflect her new status. Vanessa, for her part, had grown genuinely nervous in ways Gregory did not fully understand, because her financial obligations had grown far more urgent than she had initially admitted to him. Obligations tied to debts she had accumulated, trying to maintain a lifestyle she believed she needed in order to appear worthy of Marcus's world. She had borrowed significant sums from private lenders in the months before meeting Marcus, convinced that appearing wealthy and connected was a prerequisite for attracting a man of his status, and those loans had come with terms that grew more punishing with every passing month of interest. Collection notices had begun arriving with increasing frequency, and Vanessa had taken to intercepting the mail herself before anyone else in the household could see them, hiding the notices inside a designer handbag she kept locked in her closet. The wedding, in her private calculations, was no longer simply an opportunity. It had become the only viable solution she could see to a financial collapse she had built entirely on her own through years of careful, deliberate performance. Gregory did not know the full extent of her desperation, and Vanessa preferred it that way, understanding instinctively that a partner in a scheme who believed the stakes were merely ambitious, rather than desperate, was a partner easier to control. She continued feeding him small updates about the wedding planning, keeping him satisfied enough to maintain his silence and his continued flow of insider information about the company's financial structure. Neither of them noticed that their careful arrangement had already left small traces behind, traces that a patient, watchful woman folding towels in the hallway was slowly beginning to piece together. The truth arrived on a Thursday afternoon, while Eleanor was folding linens in the hallway, outside Vanessa's private sitting room, close enough to hear a phone conversation Vanessa never intended for anyone to catch. Vanessa's voice dropped into a tone Eleanor had not heard her use before, sharp and anxious, as she told someone on the other end of the line that the wedding needed to happen soon because her debts were closing in faster than she expected. She admitted she had borrowed heavily against the assumption that marrying Marcus would clear everything away, that she had already spent money she did not have on a lifestyle she needed to appear worthy of him, and that if the engagement fell through now, she would have nothing left and nowhere to go. She laughed bitterly and said marrying him was not about love at all, it never had been, and that a man that wealthy and that trusting was exactly the kind of solution her problems required. Eleanor stood frozen against the wall, her hands still holding a folded towel, feeling the confirmation of every instinct she had carried since that first charity gala settle heavily into her chest. She did not rush to Marcus with the news that same hour. She wanted more than a fragment of an overheard call, something undeniable enough that her son could not talk himself out of believing it later, in a quiet moment of doubt, the way hearts sometimes do when they desperately want a painful truth to be a misunderstanding instead. Over the next several days, Eleanor gathered what she could, noting dates, overhearing follow-up conversations, and once finding a stack of unopened collection notices tucked inside a designer handbag left carelessly in the laundry room. She photographed what she could without disturbing anything, understanding that Marcus would need to see proof with his own eyes rather than trust his mother's word alone, no matter how much he loved her. During that same week, Eleanor also noticed Gregory Vance visiting the mansion twice under thin professional pretexts, ostensibly to drop off documents for Marcus that could easily have been sent by courier or email instead. She watched him linger in the entryway both times, exchanging brief, tense words with Vanessa that ended the moment either of them noticed anyone else nearby. Eleanor did not yet understand the full nature of Gregory's involvement, but her instincts told her that whatever arrangement existed between him and Vanessa ran deeper than simple friendship, and she made careful note of both visits, alongside everything else she had gathered. When she finally sat down across from Marcus in his office, sliding the photographs and a written account of what she had witnessed across the desk, she watched 2 decades of careful optimism drain slowly from her son's face as the truth settled in. He read through everything twice, his hands steady in a way that worried Eleanor more than if he had shown visible anger, because she recognized in his stillness the particular grief of a man realizing he had built his happiness on a foundation that had never truly existed. She reached across the desk and took his hand, telling him quietly that none of this was his failure, that Vanessa's deception said everything about her character and nothing about his judgment, and that the hardest part, recognizing the truth, was already behind him now. Marcus called Vanessa into the mansion's dining room that same evening, requesting that the household staff clear the space entirely, except for Nora, whom he asked to remain standing quietly near the doorway, no longer disguised in purpose, even though her uniform stayed the same. Vanessa arrived expecting a conversation about seating arrangements for the wedding, her face still composed in the practiced pleasantness she wore for every occasion, and that composure held for exactly as long as it took her to notice the photographs arranged neatly on the table in front of Marcus. Her eyes moved from the images to Nora standing by the door, and something shifted behind her expression as recognition finally settled in, a slow and horrified understanding of exactly whose mother she had spent 3 weeks insulting without ever asking her name. Marcus introduced them properly for the first time, his voice quiet and controlled, in a way that unsettled Vanessa far more than shouting would have. He told her plainly that the woman she had called slow, invisible, and untrustworthy for 3 weeks was his mother, Eleanor Whitfield, the same woman who had raised him from nothing and who had asked for exactly one chance to see who Vanessa truly was before he handed her his entire life. Vanessa's confusion, turned to panic almost instantly, her carefully constructed charm cracking into a flood of excuses that grew less convincing with every sentence she offered. She insisted the phone call had been a joke, exaggerated between friends, that she loved Marcus regardless of his money and always had, that the debts were a temporary situation any engaged couple might face together. Marcus set the photographs down one at a time, asking her to explain the collection notices hidden inside her handbag, the borrowed money from private lenders, and the timeline that lined up so conveniently with the engagement announcement just months after her financial situation had grown desperate. He asked her directly whether Gregory Vance's recent visits to the house had anything to do with the company's internal financial structure, watching her face carefully for the answer before she could compose one. Vanessa's voice rose into something closer to a threat than an apology, warning Marcus that he would regret throwing away someone who understood his world the way she did. Someone sophisticated enough to stand beside him at every gala and boardroom dinner his life required. Marcus told her plainly that he would rather stand alone for the rest of his life than stand beside someone who saw him as a solution to a debt rather than a person worth loving. He asked her to leave the house before morning, and Vanessa's pleading grew more frantic as the reality of her situation set in, offering promises to change, to repay whatever she owed on her own. To prove herself worthy of a second chance, she had no real intention of earning honestly. Eleanor watched from the doorway without saying a single word, understanding that this moment belonged entirely to her son, and that the strength he showed standing firm against a woman who had once made him feel like the most important man in any room was strength he had built himself, even if she had helped plant the seed of it decades earlier. Marcus asked security to escort Vanessa out that same night, and as the door closed behind her, Eleanor crossed the room and held her son the way she used to hold him as a small boy after a difficult day, letting him lean into her without needing to explain how much the loss actually hurt beneath his composure. Within days, Marcus launched a quiet internal review of the company's financial disclosures, working alongside the company's general counsel to determine exactly how much sensitive information Gregory Vance had shared with Vanessa over the preceding months. The investigation revealed a clear pattern of unauthorized disclosures, details about investment rounds and trust structures that Gregory had no legitimate reason to discuss with anyone outside the company, let alone with the fiancée of the man whose promotion decision he had never forgiven. Marcus met with Gregory personally, laying out the evidence without raising his voice, and watched a man he had once respected for his tenure attempt to minimize 15 years of loyalty into an excuse for betrayal. Gregory was terminated immediately, and Marcus made the difficult decision to involve legal counsel regarding the confidentiality violations, understanding that protecting the company meant holding people accountable regardless of how long they had been part of its story. Simone Carter, who had noticed Gregory's suspicious closeness with Vanessa months earlier and dismissed her own instincts as overthinking, felt a quiet vindication mixed with regret that she had not spoken up sooner when she first noticed the pattern. Marcus reassured her that she had done nothing wrong, that trusting colleagues until given clear reason not to was not a failure of judgment, but a basic decency most workplaces depended on to function at all. He found himself, in the weeks following Vanessa's departure, relying on Simone's steadiness more than he consciously realized, appreciating the way she managed the fallout of the broken engagement with quiet professionalism, shielding him from unnecessary questions, and handling the company's public relations with a calm competence that never once made the crisis about her own convenience. In the months that followed, Marcus found himself thinking of Simone more often than he expected, remembering small moments from the office that he had dismissed at the time as simple friendliness, and slowly recognizing that the qualities he had once mistaken for unremarkable were in fact the very things Vanessa had never possessed. He began finding reasons to walk past her desk, to ask her opinion on decisions that did not strictly require her input, and to notice the particular way she made everyone around her feel steady and respected regardless of their title. Eleanor, watching from a comfortable distance now that her disguise had long since been retired, saw the shift happening before her son fully admitted it to himself, and she allowed herself a quiet, private hope she had not felt in years. Simone, for her part, carried her own quiet uncertainty about growing closer to Marcus, aware of the obvious complications of dating a man who signed her paychecks, and aware too of her mother's ongoing medical needs back in Memphis that left little room in her life for a relationship built on anything less than complete honesty. She had watched him grieve the end of his engagement with a dignity that impressed her, never once speaking poorly of Vanessa in the office, despite having every reason to, and she found herself slowly drawn to a man who seemed to value her judgment as much as her presence. When Marcus finally asked her to dinner outside the office, nervous in a way his mother had rarely witnessed from a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, Simone accepted, though she privately promised herself she would guard her heart carefully until she understood his intentions fully. Eleanor recognized the same trembling hope in her son that she had once carried, raising him alone with nothing but a promise that things would eventually get better. Marcus decided he needed one final certainty before he let himself fall completely. Remembering the painful lesson Vanessa had taught him about how easily wealth could disguise a person's true intentions, he arranged a fabricated crisis at the company, letting word spread that a critical investment had failed and that he stood to lose nearly everything he had built, watching carefully to see whether Simone's warmth would survive contact with his apparent ruin, the way Vanessa's never had. Word of the company's supposed failure spread through Nashville's business circles within a single week, and Marcus watched the same pattern he had witnessed after Vanessa's exposure repeat itself among his wider circle of associates. Friends who had once called weekly grew suddenly difficult to reach. Business contacts who had courted his partnership for years stopped returning messages entirely, and even a longtime friend named James, someone Marcus had considered close since college, told him over the phone that he had his own issues to deal with, and thought it best they kept some distance for a while. Marcus absorbed each small abandonment quietly, understanding that this too was information, a confirmation of exactly how conditional most relationships in his life had become once his wealth appeared to be in question. Simone showed up at his significantly smaller rented office within a day of hearing the news, not with sympathy performed for an audience, but with a genuine offer to help however she could, insisting that his worth had never been measured by a balance sheet, and never would be. She brought him coffee from the same modest shop she visited every morning, sat with him while he worked through the appearance of disaster, and spoke about rebuilding with the same steady confidence she brought to every difficult problem at the office. She suggested practical steps, offering to help him draft a consulting proposal using his existing expertise, reminding him that his knowledge and reputation had not disappeared simply because his balance sheet had temporarily changed. Marcus watched her stay through an entire week of manufactured hardship without once asking what remained of his fortune, and he understood finally that he had found in her everything his mother had spent her whole life trying to teach him to look for. He confessed the truth to Simone gently, admitting the crisis had never been real, and braced himself for anger he knew he deserved after deceiving her the same way he had once tested Vanessa. Simone was hurt, and she told him so plainly, reminding him that trust could not be built on a foundation of tests and hidden agendas, no matter how understandable his fears might be after everything Vanessa had put him through. She explained that she had spent the entire week genuinely worried about him, rearranging her own tight schedule and her mother's care arrangements to make time to help him through what she believed was a real crisis, and learning it had all been fabricated left her questioning what else about their relationship might not be entirely honest. Marcus listened without defending himself, understanding that her hurt was legitimate regardless of his intentions, and he told her honestly that his fear of being loved for the wrong reasons had made him careless with the trust of someone who had never given him a single reason to doubt her. He promised her that this test would be the last one, that he understood now the difference between protecting his heart and punishing the people who had already proven themselves worthy of it. Simone considered his apology carefully over the following days, weighing her hurt against the genuine remorse she saw in him, and eventually chose to forgive him, on the condition that he never test her loyalty in secret again, a condition Marcus accepted, without hesitation or negotiation. Eleanor welcomed Simone into the family, not as a stranger being evaluated, but as a woman she had already come to admire during those quiet weeks working side by side in the mansion's kitchen, when neither of them had known the other's whole story. She told Simone one evening over tea that she had recognized something familiar in her from their very first conversation, a particular kind of strength that came from carrying responsibility for a parent's well-being, while still showing up for the world with an open heart. Simone, in turn, found herself grateful to have a future mother-in-law who understood exactly the kind of pressure she carried, having lived a version of it herself decades earlier. The ceremony took place in the same backyard where Marcus had played as a boy, back when their entire world fit inside a rented duplex, and Eleanor's dreams for him were as small and specific as a warm meal and a roof that did not leak. She had insisted on this location herself, turning down Marcus's offer of a grand ballroom downtown, telling him that the truest things in their lives had never happened in rooms built to impress anyone. White chairs lined the modest lawn, and string lights hung between the same oak trees Eleanor used to hang laundry on decades earlier. And as Simone walked toward Marcus, in a simple dress she had chosen herself, without a stylist's input, Eleanor understood that this was the wedding she had quietly hoped for since the night her son was born. Marcus stood waiting with the same steady certainty that had once made him promise his mother he would never forget where he came from. And Eleanor watched him keep that promise now in the clearest way she had ever seen. Simone's own mother had traveled up from Memphis for the occasion. Her health stable enough for the trip, after months of treatment Simone had quietly helped fund. And the two mothers sat together during the ceremony. Two women who had spent years stretching paychecks and praying over their children, now watching those children build something neither of them could have purchased with any amount of money. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest and allowed herself, finally, to cry openly in front of everyone, no longer needing to hide her feelings behind the quiet composure of Nora the maid or the careful strength she had worn every day since her husband died. Marcus found his mother in the crowd before he found anyone else, crossing the lawn to hold her tightly, and he whispered against her ear that none of this, not the company, not the mansion, not this moment, would exist without every sacrifice she had made when there had been no one else to make them. Eleanor held her son the way she had held him as an infant decades earlier, feeling the same fierce protectiveness she had carried since the night he was born, now settled finally into something closer to peace than fear. Eleanor Whitfield thought often, in the quiet months that followed, about the young widow she used to be, standing in a cramped kitchen, counting coins, and wondering if she had the strength to raise a good man, alone in a world that had already taken so much from both of them. She had made only one promise to herself in those early years, that her son would grow up understanding the difference between people who loved him and people who simply wanted something from him, even if it meant she had to put on a maid's uniform decades later and walk back into the very kind of work she had spent her whole life trying to leave behind. She never regretted the disguise, not for a single day, because it had given her something no amount of money or comfort ever could, the certainty that her son had finally chosen a life built on truth instead of appearances. She thought, too, about Vanessa sometimes, not with bitterness but with a quiet sadness for a woman so consumed by fear of having nothing that she had been willing to become someone worth nothing in the process. Eleanor had learned long ago that people reveal themselves most honestly in the rooms where they believe no one worth impressing is watching, and she hoped, in whatever life Vanessa built next, that someone might teach her the lesson, kindness costs nothing, before it cost her everything again. She thought about Gregory too, a man who had let 15 years of loyalty curdle into betrayal over a single disappointment, and she wondered how differently his story might have unfolded had he simply spoken his grievance honestly instead of letting it fester into something that cost him everything he had built. As for her own family, she watched Marcus and Simone build a home filled with the same values she had scraped together out of nothing all those years ago, values built on honesty, on showing up for people even when it cost something, on measuring a person's worth by their character rather than their circumstances. She watched Simone care for her own mother with the same devotion Eleanor recognized from her own life, and she understood that she had not simply gained a daughter-in-law, she had gained someone who already understood, in her bones, everything Eleanor had spent a lifetime trying to teach her son. Her work, the long nights decades earlier, the folded towels in a mansion that was not truly hers to clean, the years of quiet watching and waiting, had never really been about protecting her son's fortune at all. It had always been about protecting his heart, and in the end, that was the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered.